This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want to pre-order Foundations, use my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nitsa Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. We are now in the midst of Foundations preview season, and it's a super fast preview season. Preview season really kicked into full gear yesterday, and it will be over by next Friday, when my set review will begin on November 1st. So because preview season just started, we have kind of less information than we normally do about this set than I usually have in the video I do a week before the set review starts for most formats. But we do have a significant amount of information, and the nature of this set as a core set also means it's probably not that much more information. But before we get into talking about all of that, I want to remind you that if you are interested in Limited, I do have some set review related perks for channel members and patrons. The main things are that you get access to my ongoing set review notes, which are being compiled now as new cards are previewed. And at the end of the set review, you end up getting a spreadsheet with all of my grades for how I feel about the format going into it. So if those things interest you, you can become a channel member or a patron. You can find ways to do those things in the description. So let's talk a little bit first about what this set is exactly, because it's a different sort of animal than we've seen in a while. It is a core set. They're calling it an evergreen core set, and the evergreen part doesn't really matter if you're mostly a limited player, but it is interesting in that this set will be in standard for several years, till 2029. So that's why it's called Foundations, partly. The other thing about core sets is they tend to be modern core sets anyway, since Core Set 2010 or Magic 2010, I guess it was called back then. They are about half reprints and half new cards. So this has way more reprints than a normal set does. So that's one of the big differences. You know, a lot of times going into a set review or evaluating cards, most of the time, I haven't played with like 95% of them. In this set, it's like 50%. So you do have some idea about these cards, more so than you normally would, but it is a new context, so you still don't know everything, but it is an interesting thing about this kind of set. The other things are that these sorts of sets are usually more simple. They're supposed to be on-ramps for new players. So cards are less complex, and honestly, that kind of palette cleanser is going to be pretty nice since we've been playing crazy complicated cards for a while now, and so far from the previews we've seen, it does feel like for the most part they've stuck to keeping the cards simplified. That also means generally that core sets are less synergistic because they don't want to have quite as many card interactions and complicated things going on, and that does often mean there's less synergy. So this kind of set is often more about just curving out and stuff like that. That's not to say there aren't synergies, there are archetypes and stuff like that. They're just less pronounced. There is also a special guest bonus sheet, but that's the only bonus sheet this time. We haven't had a real bonus sheet in a few sets now, just special guests this time, which are super rare, and there's only 10 of them. So that's what the set contents are. It's a little bit different than what we've seen being a core set, and it's going to feel, I think, different based on the previews we've seen so far than we've seen before. I think in general, the set looks less powerful, too, than what we've seen before. Simple doesn't always mean less powerful, right? I mean, Lightning Bolt and Wrath of God are simple cards, right? But so far from what we've seen, it does feel a little less powerful. So let's go ahead and take a look at the mechanics in the set, and they're all returning mechanics. That's another thing about core sets. They don't want to throw too much at new players. They want the set to be simple. So the mechanics that are in the set are all really simple ones. So let's take a look at those and talk about how they've played in Limited in the past and how I think they'll play here. So Flashback is back. You know, this is a mechanic where you can cast a card from your graveyard for its flashback cost, and then you exile it. I should say instants and sorceries. Think Twice is a reprint that's in this set that we're going to have in this limited format that has flashback. These kinds of cards are always interesting. I mean, typically, the total amount of mana you pay is not especially good. Like 5 mana draw 2 sounds awful, right? But you get to pay it in installments with Think Twice, and it also means that if you mill Think Twice, if it ends up in your graveyard some other way, you can still get a card back. So you ultimately get a 2-for-1, even though it's a kind of inefficient one, but it's often worth it, especially if the format ends up not being super fast. Cards like this get to be even better because you're more likely to be able to have time to cast both halves. Additionally, the format does look like it has a spell deck. Like, I'll talk a little more about what I think the archetypes are going to be later in the video, but most of them are just sort of the classic archetypes we've seen before. We haven't seen signpost uncommons yet, but what we do know is that the archetypes are going to be pretty typical classic ones we've seen, and I have a feeling blue-red is going to be spells, and when that's true, a card like Think Twice and all cards with flashback get even better because you trigger your spell stuff more. So, flashback, it's a nice value mechanic that also pays you off for doing graveyard stuff, in addition to just letting you cast a card a couple of times. And it's a nice, simple design that old players and new players, I think, will enjoy. So I think it was a good choice. On a related note, talking about spell decks, Prowess is also back. The card they've shown us so far with Prowess is Light Shell Duo. So that's a very recent reprint, right? And I think it's a nice one because, you know, I kind of liked what they did in Bloomborough overall with these sort of signpost commons where they check a box in 2 different decks of their color. That's something I'd like to see them do more of because I think it did make the format more synergistic in a lot of ways. In Light Shell Duo, you know, it's got Prowess. This means whenever you cast it on creature spell, the thing with Prowess gets +1/+1. This counts instant sorceries, enchantments, artifacts, planeswalkers, all those things that aren't creatures. And the mechanic tends to be pretty nice because you can threaten to grow your creature at instant speed. You know, Think Twice is an example of a card that if you have 5 mana up, you can draw 2, give your Light Shell Duo +2/+2, which is often enough to win combat. Obviously, Surveil's in the mechanic in the format too, but Surveil is a evergreen mechanic at this point, so we don't need to talk about it. Just like we're not talking about flying or ward or any of those things. But yeah, Prowess is around. I think blue-red is going to be a Prowess deck. It'd be very surprising if it's not. We've also got Raid back. This is a mechanic that I don't love. It reminds me a little too much. You know, it's older than Survival. Somehow, when I was evaluating cards with Survival, I didn't think about how they sort of feel similar to Raid cards, but they kind of have a similar problem where if you can't attack, if you can't do anything to trigger Raid, a lot of the cards with it are bad, and that is kind of a problem. You have to be ahead a lot of the time to trigger Raid. But anyway, Raid means at the beginning of your end step, if you attack this turn, something happens. We've got Seer Slicer Goblin as a card with Raid in the set. This one does look really good. You know, it gives you a 1/1 Goblin at your end step. It's a 2-mana 2/1 itself. And if you have like a really good curve out where you play a 1-drop, you can attack with it on turn 2. Then you play Seer Slicer Goblin on turn 2 also. Like, the game is just over a lot of the time because you've added so many bodies to the board for so little, and it just keeps sort of snowballing from there. So Seer Slicer Goblin's a good example. I mean, you can send the Goblin token in for free every turn and then still get a Goblin token back, right? So it ends up being able to add to the board a lot. It's really powerful. But there are cards where, like, you have to be able to trigger Raid or they're not nearly as good. And when we've seen it in the past, it's been okay. I think it's better than Survival because, like, for one thing, your creature doesn't have to survive. Like, the creature that triggers the thing isn't also the one that has to attack. It can, but it doesn't have to. And that was one of the problems with Survival. So I think Raid will be nice. It will certainly let more aggressive decks kind of snowball things early if they have Raid triggers like Seer Slicer Goblin and stuff like that. And then the last mechanic, these are the 4 mechanics that are heavily featured in the set, those being Flashback, Raid, Prowess, and now Threshold. So Threshold is back. We just saw this one recently too. It's kind of interesting they've gone back to the well because it took them like, I don't know, 20 years to do Threshold again, and now they've done it twice within a few months. I do think it's a good mechanic. It's simple too, like all of these are, where you just have to count cards in your graveyard and then a thing happens. You know, things like Delirium and the like, or cards that check for card types in general in graveyards are a little more daunting, especially for newer players. Just counting the number of cards is much easier, and I think much better overall. Getting 7 into your graveyard isn't always easy, but the format looks like it's got support for it. For example, I think Light Shell Duo, like I'm guessing blue-black and black-green are probably both graveyard-oriented decks. You know, black-green probably more into creatures, blue-black probably more into control-type stuff. Since, those are sort of typical things that we see. So, Light Shell Duo can help you get to Threshold, and I'm sure there will be other cards in the set that help you pull that off too. So those are the big mechanics that you're going to see a lot of on commons, uncommons, rares, and mythics in the format, and I think some of them are going to have special synergies in the set. I mean, obviously, Raid's going to be good in aggro decks. Threshold's going to be good in graveyard decks. Flashback's going to be good in a lot of decks, but especially spell decks, and the same is true of Prowess. One other thing of note, I mean, it's not a huge thing for limited players, but there are 5 Planeswalkers in the set. They're all mythic, that's why I say it's not a huge thing, but we haven't seen that many in a while, so that does mean any card that can also hit a Planeswalker is slightly better than we've seen lately, because lately we've had like 1 to 2 Planeswalkers in a set. 5 is a lot more, so that is one thing to keep in mind as well. And then there's one thing that's a rule change, and normally I don't feel like in the past I've looked at rule changes in this kind of video. Maybe I have, but this one I think really matters for limited, and that is that they changed how combat damage assignment order works. What I mean by that is, if your opponent double blocks your creature you're attacking with, you, the attacker, have to decide which creature gets dealt damage first, and then once that creature's dealt lethal, you can do the rest of the damage to the other creature. That's how you have to divide the damage. Until now. Now there's no such thing as combat damage assignment order, and the reason this comes up in limited is like, and more than anywhere else, is like double blocks don't happen that much elsewhere. They happen pretty regularly in limited, and so that does make a difference. And so how does that sort of double block or triple block or whatever blocking with more than one thing, how does that work now? Well, they made it so that the attacking player is a little bit better off, because one of the big bummers of dividing combat damage, having to do it in combat damage assignment order, is your opponent could buff the creature that you're assigning the damage to first, and then you don't kill anything, right? Like that was one of the ways that combat tricks rather, could sort of blow players out. That isn't a thing anymore. You can still use the trick, but now the attacking player only decides how the damage is done once it's time for the damage to be done, and you can divide it however you want. Generally, you're still going to want to try to do lethal to one thing and then do the rest to the other. But if you have a card that does 2 damage to everything and your opponent's blocking with 2 3/3s, you can do 1 to each of them and then do 2 damage to everything. So you can divide the damage better so the attacking player has more control. They don't get blown out by combat tricks, because now you know when you decide to assign the damage just how big those creatures will be. So that is a real change. I mean, it's not a mechanic per se, but it's a change that is going to be in force on day 1 of this format that isn't unlikely to come up like in your first draft. So that is now how combat damage works. It really only applies when it comes to double blocking or, blocking with more than one creature, but that matters in limited. So, like I said, we don't have signpost uncommons yet. There are some early synergistic things going on from the preview cards we have seen that make me think a few things are true. One of them is that usually core sets have really classic mechanics for the color pairs anyway, because part of the purpose of this kind of set is to introduce people to what the color pairs are about, right? Because they've never played Magic before. And so, like I said, I think blue-red is probably prowess/spells. Black-green's probably the graveyard. Blue-black's probably like control graveyard. Red-white's probably aggro. Blue-white is probably skies. That sort of thing. They're all going to kind of be what we expect them to be. The mechanics, the archetypes we see all the time when we play, that we see in regular sets too, just not in every single set. But there's also a bunch of typal stuff going on, and like the cards that have significant typal support, the types that do so far are vampires, cats, zombies, wizards. Whether it's going to be interesting to see if they decide to associate each color pair with a creature type too. Like, I could see that happening. It wouldn't, they do that where they have a mechanical and a creature type theme. But if they do, it kind of looks like the creature type thing is secondary and the mechanical thing is primary so far. So that's pretty much it for my early look. We've got less to talk about because there are 0 new mechanics in this set. I guess the combat damage thing is the closest we get. And we don't have as many cards or things to talk about as usual because preview season's super short this time around. But that does mean the set review starts soon. It'll start, like I said earlier in the video, this coming Friday on November 1st. I'll be diving into every card in the set. I'll be evaluating all the new ones and the reprints for this new context. Some of them are reprints we haven't seen in a long time, so it'll be interesting to do that. So that does it for this video. If you want to get access to set review related perks like my set review notes and my final grades for each of the cards once I'm done with the set review, don't forget you can become a channel member or a patron to gain access to those things. You can find ways to do those in the description. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, including draft videos of this format, more analysis of this format, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.